The biggest chunk of your grade in this class comes from analytical responses. So we need to think about what the word analysis, the root of analytic, means. What analysis is looking at information and drawing conclusions based on that information. So what I will do each week is I will ask you a question or a series of questions, and I'm going to ask you to respond to that question. I don't just want your opinion, though. Rather, your opinion isn't necessarily going to get you a good grade. What you need to do is back up an opinion with evidence so that it's not just an opinion. Everybody can have opinions, right? I like blue, it's a great color. Instead, it's something that you can point to evidence and say, my claim, my statement, my argument is correct because look at this, this, and this. So for this week, I've assigned 3 different primary sources. 2 of them have questions related to them in the analytical response, 1 does not. So let's take a look real quick at Enkidu's dream, and let's think about a type of question I might ask you and use that as a way to tease out a potential response. So if the question is, how did ancient Mesopotamians view the afterlife? Heaven, hell, whatever they called it. And how did where they lived shape how they viewed that afterlife, where they went after they died? Well, then we might use Enkidu's dream to answer that. So let's look at this real quickly. This is the exact same thing that's assigned to you, and I'm going to read through it. As Enkidu slept alone in his sickness, in bitterness of spirit, he poured out his heart to his friend Gilgamesh. Okay, so Enkidu is dying. He is having a heart-to-heart with Gilgamesh, his BFF. He says to Gilgamesh, "Listen, my friend, this is a dream I dreamt last night." So he's telling him about a dream he had that is going to detail what afterlife looks like. The heavens roared. The earth rumbled back in answer. Between them I stood before an awful being, the somber-faced man-bird. He had directed me on his purpose. His was a vampire face. His foot was a lion's foot. His hand was an eagle's talon. He fell on me, and his claws were in my hair, and he held me fast, and I smothered. Then he transformed me so that my arms became wings covered with feathers. He turned his stare towards me, and he led me away to the palace of Ilkala, the queen of darkness, to the house from which none who enters ever returns, down the road from which there is no coming back. So this sounds fantastical, right? I would love to see a big screen adaptation of it, but it's also scary. So right off the bat, we know that Enkidu's view of the afterlife, which is probably one shared by lots of other people, is that it's a scary place with really scary creatures that are part human and part God, and they transform you. Okay, so let's talk about this house from which nobody comes back. This is the house whose people sit in darkness. Dust is their food, clay is their meat. If we think about where Mesopotamians lived and what would be important to them, they've got to go grow crops to survive, right? What is essential for crops? Water and sunlight. So if you're in an area that is dusty, it's clear that there hasn't been much water, you're in full darkness, this is the exact opposite of where you would want to live. This seems like their version of hell. People are clothed like birds with wings for covering. They see no light. They sit in darkness. I entered the house of dust, and I saw the kings of the earth, their crowns put away forever, rulers and princes, all those who were once kingly, crowns, and, excuse me, my writing is a little small here, crowns, and ruled the world in the days of old. Those who had stood in the place of gods like Anu and Enlil stood now like servants. They fetched baked meats in the house of dust to carry cooked meat and cold water from the water skin. Okay, so everybody who had been awesome on earth beforehand is now humble servants. And what do? They do what the gods want them to do. So even if they were the greatest, most important people in the world, in the grand scheme of things compared to gods, they are nothing. And while they're eating clay and dust, they're taking refreshingly cold water and cooked steaks to the gods. In the house of dust, of which I entered, were high priests and acolytes, priests of the incarnation and of ecstasy. There were servers of the temple. There was Etana, the king of Kish, whom the eagle carried to heaven in the days of old. I saw also Samargan, god of the cattle. There was the queen of the underworld. All these people who are important both in terms of gods and kings. And this woman raises her head. She sees him and speaks, "Who brought you here?" And then he came out of his dream. He awoke, he describes himself like a man drained of blood who wanders alone in waters of rushes, like one whom the bailiff had seized and his heart pounded with terror. He is somebody who is scared. After this, Enkidu keeps getting sicker and sicker. It seems like this presages his death, and eventually he dies. Gilgamesh, grief-stricken, a great mighty king who cries and shows great loss when his friend passes away. That kind of tells us something about even the biggest king can be sad. Weeps for 7 days, finally allows him to be buried. Okay, how could we take all this information and turn it into an answer to this question? I'm glad you asked. Let's look on the next slide.